His voice was a low whisper in the silent, opulent room, a sound like velvet and danger. "They tried to take you from me before I even had you," he murmured, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "That will never happen again." Daniela's eyes fluttered open, the haze of pain medication clouding her vision as she stared at the handsome, imposing man who held her captive. She had saved his life. But as she looked into the dark intensity of his gaze, she realized she might have just lost her own. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story began not in a palace of silk and shadows, but in a small, third-floor apartment that smelled of lemon cleaner and brewing coffee. This was Daniela Cruz's world, a fortress of her own making, built on responsibility and late nights. As a paralegal for a downtown law firm, her life was a meticulously organized collection of case files, color-coded tabs, and the quiet hum of a window air conditioning unit that rattled more than it cooled. The worn but spotless floral sofa was a testament to her hard work, a thrift store find she had reupholstered herself. Every throw pillow, every framed print on the wall was a small victory in her battle for a stable, predictable life. A life starkly different from the one she and her brother had been born into. She was highlighting a clause in a prenuptial agreement, her pen moving with practiced precision, when the frantic banging on her door shattered the evening's peace. It wasn't a knock, it was a desperate summons. She knew, with a sinking heart, who it was. Daniela swung the door open to find her younger brother Rico, looking like a cornered animal. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive jacket was rumpled, and his eyes, wide with panic, darted past her into the sanctuary of her apartment. He pushed inside, running a hand through his hair. "Danny, I'm in trouble, bad trouble." A familiar weariness settled over her. It was a conversation they'd had in various forms since he was a teenager, but the fear in his eyes tonight was new, sharper. "Rico, what have you done?" she asked, her voice low and steady, a practiced calm she rarely felt. "This isn't just some corner bookie, is it? You're swimming with sharks." He paced the small living room, his chaotic energy a stark contrast to the room's careful order. "Worse than sharks, it's Giovanni Vitale." The name hung in the air, heavy and cold. Daniela felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rattling air conditioner. Giovanni Vitale wasn't just a name whispered in the city's underbelly. He was a legend, a businessman whose empire was built on foundations she knew were anything but legitimate. His face was occasionally in the papers, always impeccably dressed, always exuding an aura of untouchable power. "I owe money, Danny, a lot." He finally stopped pacing and faced her, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation. "A bad bet. It spiraled. It's over $100,000. Daniela sank onto the arm of her sofa, the number stealing the air from her lungs. It was an impossible sum, a figure from the world of the wealthy clients she worked for, not from their world. "How did you even get involved with him?" "I'm a driver," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "Low-level stuff." Or it was. "He knows about the debt. He called me in today." Rico's face, usually so full of charm and easy confidence, crumpled. "But he offered me a way out. He said he'd clear it, all of it, in exchange for my absolute loyalty. He wants to know who I am, what my family is like." Daniela's protective instincts, always simmering just below the surface, flared hot and sharp. "And what does that have to do with me?" "He wants to have dinner, tonight." Rico rushed on, grabbing her hands. His were cold and clammy. "He wants me to bring you. He said he values loyalty, family. If he sees I have a good family, a sister like you, a professional, someone respectable, it will make all the difference." "Please, Danny, I'm drowning here. It's just a dinner. A formality to solidify my position." "He's a good man, Danny, a businessman." She looked at her brother, at the desperate plea in his eyes, and felt the familiar, painful tug of her love for him. He was reckless and charming and had a talent for finding trouble, but he was her only family. Her gut screamed at her that this was a terrible, dangerous idea, a step into a world she had worked her entire life to avoid. But the image of him drowning, as he put it, was more powerful than her fear. She saw the little boy she'd promised their mother she would always protect. "Okay, Rico," she heard herself say, the words tasting like ash. I'll go, for you. The restaurant was a world away from her modest apartment. It was an exclusive Italian place called Il Silenzio, a name that felt more like a command than an invitation. The lighting was low and intimate, casting long shadows that danced on walls of dark, polished wood. The air was thick with the scent of garlic, wine, and money. At a secluded table in the back, surrounded by a few quiet, watchful men, sat Giovanni Vitale. He was even more imposing in person. Dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than her car, he radiated an aura of absolute authority. He wasn't handsome in a soft, conventional way. His features were too sharp, his jaw too severe, but the combined effect was magnetic. When they approached, his eyes, dark and startlingly perceptive, flickered from Rico to her. He rose from his chair, a gesture of old-world politeness that seemed at odds with his reputation. "Rico," he said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone. "And this must be your sister, Daniela. It is a pleasure." His gaze lingered on her, an assessment that was both unnerving and, to her surprise, tinged with a flicker of genuine interest. He held her chair for her, his fingers brushing her arm, a touch that sent an unexpected jolt through her. The conversation was a minefield. Giovanni's questions to Rico were sharp and penetrating, veiled tests of his loyalty and nerve. Daniela, drawing on her professional poise, tried to steer the conversation toward safer ground, speaking about her work, about the city, presenting a calm, intelligent front that she hoped would reflect well on her brother. Giovanni listened, his attention shifting more and more to her. He seemed amused, intrigued by her composure in this den of wolves. She could feel his eyes on her even when he was speaking to Rico, a constant, unnerving pressure. The chaos erupted in a heartbeat. One moment, a waiter was approaching with a bottle of wine. The next, the bottle was dropping, and a gun with a silencer was in his hand, its dark muzzle pointed directly at Giovanni's chest. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. Daniela saw the glint of the weapon, the cold fury in the fake waiter's eyes, and the way her brother, Rico, was sitting directly in the line of fire, just beside his boss. There was no thought, no decision. There was only a primal, blinding instinct. With a desperate cry, she shoved Rico's chair with all her might, sending him tumbling sideways. In the same motion, she threw herself across the small space between them, a human shield for a man she barely knew, to protect the brother she loved. A muffled cough from the silencer. A searing, white-hot agony exploded in her shoulder. The force of it was like a physical blow, stealing her breath and her senses. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of screams, overturned chairs, and the smell of gunpowder. The last thing she saw was Giovanni's face, his legendary composure shattered by a look of pure, unadulterated shock and fury. The last thing she heard was her name, torn from his throat in a guttural, horrified roar. "Daniela!" Then his arms were catching her as she fell, and the world dissolved into darkness. Consciousness returned not all at once, but in fragmented pieces, like driftwood washing ashore after a storm. There were hushed voices that seemed to come from a great distance, a persistent, dull ache that had settled deep in her shoulder, and a sensation of impossible softness against her skin. She was floating in a sea of gray, a place between worlds where pain was a distant echo and reality had not yet taken hold. For a time, she drifted, aware of nothing but the rhythmic beat of a machine somewhere nearby and the weight of a hand holding her own. When she finally surfaced, it was to a room bathed in the soft, filtered light of a late afternoon. Her eyes fluttered open, heavy and slow, struggling to focus. The ceiling was impossibly high, adorned with intricate plasterwork she might have admired in a museum. She was lying in a bed that felt larger than her entire bedroom, swathed in a duvet made of what could only be silk, its weight both comforting and confining. An IV tube was taped neatly to the back of her hand, snaking its way to a pole beside the bed. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see a vast, manicured garden, a riot of autumn colors under a pale sky. A slight movement drew her gaze. He was sitting in a plush armchair by her bed, as if he had been carved from the shadows of the opulent room. It was Giovanni Vitale. He looked different than he had in the restaurant, the sharp edges of his authority softened by a visible fatigue. There were faint, dark circles under his eyes, and his usually immaculate suit jacket was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his forearms. But his focus, his entire being, was directed at her. The moment he saw her eyes were open, he leaned forward, his expression a complex mixture of relief and something else, something far more intense. "You're awake," he said, his voice a soft caress that seemed to vibrate in the quiet air. He explained that she was at his private estate, miles outside the city. She had been unconscious for 2 days, cared for by his personal physician. "You're safe now," he continued, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, a gesture that was both soothing and proprietary. "No one can hurt you here. I won't let them." Her mind was a fog of confusion and pain medication, but one thought cut through the haze, sharp and urgent. Her throat was dry, her voice a weak rasp. "Rico," she managed to say, "is my brother okay?" A flicker of something unreadable passed through Giovanni's eyes before he smoothed it away. "He is fine. Scared, but untouched. You saved his life, Daniela. You saved my life." His gratitude was a palpable force in the room, but it was laced with an unnerving intensity, a possessiveness that coiled in the pit of her stomach. He looked at her not just as a man indebted, but as a man who had found something precious he had no intention of letting go. The feeling of his gaze on her was heavy, a blanket of security that felt dangerously close to a shroud. Giovanni assured her again that Rico was perfectly safe, and true to his word, he brought her brother to see her the following afternoon. The reunion was a torrent of emotion, but it was strained, performed under the watchful eye of one of Giovanni's guards, a mountain of a man in a dark suit who stood discreetly by the door, a silent, unmoving statue. Rico rushed to her bedside, his face a mask of guilt and fear. He looked pale, his usual swagger completely gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made him seem younger and more vulnerable than ever. "Danny, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears as he took her good hand. "I never wanted this, any of this, I swear." "It's okay, Rico," she murmured, her heart aching at his distress. "It wasn't your fault. Mr. Vitale, he says you're a hero," Rico continued, his eyes darting nervously toward the door where the guard stood. "He says he owes you everything. He took care of my debt, Danny. Wiped it clean. And he's given me a new job. Something more important. A sign of his gratitude," he said. He tried to smile, to reassure her that everything was going to be fine, but his eyes betrayed him. They were wide with a terror that went far beyond guilt. He was terrified of Giovanni, of the world he had dragged his sister into. The visit was short, the conversation stilted and hollow, every word shadowed by the silent observer in the corner. After Rico left, a profound sense of unease began to settle over Daniela. The invisible walls of her new reality were starting to close in. She tried to push herself up, a sudden, desperate need to call her office, to check on her apartment, to connect with the life that now felt a million miles away. But a wave of dizziness and a sharp protest from her shoulder sent her falling back against the pillows, weak and breathless. Just then, the door opened and a woman entered. She was in her late 50s, with her hair pulled back in a severe bun and a crisp professional demeanor. "I am Elena," she announced, her voice polite but firm. "I am Mr. Vitale's housekeeper. I am here to assist you." She moved with an efficiency that felt less like help and more like management, fluffing Daniela's pillows and checking her IV drip with practiced hands. "Mr. Vitale has given strict instructions for your recovery," Elena stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You are not to worry about a thing. Everything you need is here. You are not to overexert yourself." It was a polite instruction, but the underlying message was clear. She was a patient, but she was also under command. A pattern began, establishing itself with the quiet, relentless rhythm of a clock. The days belonged to the staff. A private nurse, a kind but reserved woman named Sophia, would check her vitals and change her bandages. Elena would bring her meals on delicate porcelain, anything she could possibly desire, from fresh squeezed orange juice to steaming bowls of broth. The room was constantly filled with flowers, enormous bouquets of lilies, roses, and orchids that filled the air with a cloying, funereal sweetness. Stacks of books appeared on her bedside table, classics and bestsellers, as if to fill the long, silent hours. But the nights belonged to Giovanni. As darkness fell, he would dismiss the nurse with a quiet word. Sophia would nod, gather her things, and slip out of the room, leaving Daniela alone with him. He would pull the same armchair close to her bed and simply sit with her for hours. Sometimes he would talk, his deep voice a soothing murmur in the dimly lit room. He told her stories, not of violence or business, but curated anecdotes from his childhood in Sicily, tales of his mother's cooking and his grandfather's honor. He spoke of loyalty as the highest virtue and control as a simple necessity for survival. The stories were designed to create a specific image, a portrait of a man bound by a code she couldn't possibly understand. Other times, he would just watch her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. In the hazy state between waking and sleeping, fueled by the lingering effects of the pain medication, she would feel him gently brush a stray strand of hair from her forehead. He would whisper to her in the dark, his voice a constant, hypnotic presence. He told her she was brave, that she was special, that in his entire life he had never met anyone like her. The words seeped into her subconscious, blurring the lines between savior and captor, between gratitude and fear. One night, as she drifted on the edge of sleep, his voice wrapped around her, a mixture of comfort and terrifying possession. "Sleep, tesoro, he murmured, the Italian endearment sounding both foreign and deeply intimate on his lips. "You're safe with me. I am your shield now." He leaned closer, his scent, a mix of expensive cologne and something uniquely him, filling her senses. "I swear on my life," he whispered, his breath warm against her temple. "No one will ever harm you again." In those unsettling, intimate hours, Daniela was caught in a strange and terrifying paradox. The shadows in the room would dance on the walls, and Giovanni's large frame seemed to fill the entire space, a looming mountain of strength and danger. She was his prisoner, she knew that on some rational level. Yet she couldn't deny the profound, primal sense of safety his presence provided. The pain medication and her own weakness made the entire experience feel dreamlike, surreal, stripping away her defenses and making it nearly impossible to resist the pull of his orbit. She was trapped in a gilded cage, and its bars were beginning to feel terrifyingly like a protective embrace. As the days bled into a week, then two, Daniela's physical strength returned in small, incremental victories. The deep, throbbing ache in her shoulder subsided to a dull, persistent complaint, and she could finally sit up without the room spinning. Soon, she was walking, her steps at first tentative, then more confident, as she began to pace the confines of her luxurious suite. The rooms that had once seemed like a palace of recovery now felt like the world's most opulent cage. Her exploration led her to a set of French doors that opened onto a private stone balcony, and for the first time, she saw the full scope of her prison. Below her lay a breathtaking expanse of emerald lawn, dotted with formal gardens where autumn roses bloomed in defiant bursts of crimson and white. A swimming pool, a perfect sheet of turquoise, shimmered in the cool sunlight, and in the distance she could see what looked like guest houses and tennis courts. It was a world of immense wealth and privilege, a self-contained kingdom. But her eyes were drawn to the perimeter. The entire estate was enclosed by a formidable stone wall, at least 12 feet high, its top glinting with what she suspected was wire, and patrolling the manicured pathways below, moving with a quiet, purposeful gait, were guards. They were dressed in the same dark suits as the man who had watched over Rico's visit, their presence a constant, chilling reminder that the beauty was a facade. The vibrant flowers seemed to mock her confinement, and the warm sun on her skin felt wonderful, but the sight of those high walls sent a shiver of pure dread down her spine. Her frustration, a slow-burning fuse, finally ignited. She was a person, not a porcelain doll to be kept on a shelf. She had a life, responsibilities, a world that existed beyond these fortified walls. She found Elena arranging a new bouquet of lilies in the sitting room, their scent now overwhelmingly funereal. "Elena, I need my phone," Daniela said, her voice polite but firm, "and my laptop. I have to contact my employer, handle my bills, my apartment." The housekeeper turned, her expression as smooth and unreadable as polished marble. "Mr. Vitale is handling all outside matters, Miss Cruz," she replied, her tone unflappable. "He wants to ensure your complete peace and security. He has already informed your work that you are on an extended, paid medical leave due to a family emergency. All of your personal affairs are being managed." The casual, absolute control in that statement stole Daniela's breath. He hadn't just isolated her, he had erased her, placing her life on hold with a single, powerful command. A cold anger began to replace her fear. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm not a prisoner. I need my phone, Elena." "Mr. Vitale is simply being thorough," Elena said, her loyalty absolute. "The men who did this to you are still out there. Your security is his only concern." Deciding a different approach was needed, Daniela waited until later that afternoon. Her suite, she discovered, was at the end of a long, quiet hallway lined with priceless-looking art. She walked with as much casual purpose as she could muster, her heart hammering against her ribs. She would find a landline, walk out the front door, anything to reclaim a piece of her own life. She reached the end of the hall, where it opened into a grand, sweeping staircase that descended into a marble foyer. But her path was blocked. A guard, as large and immovable as the one from before, stood there. He wasn't looking at her, but he was aware of her, his entire posture a silent barrier. He inclined his head politely as she approached. "Miss Cruz, I was just going to look around," she said, trying to sound nonchalant. "My apologies, miss," he said, his voice respectful but utterly inflexible. "Mr. Vitale wishes for you to remain in your wing for your own safety until you are fully recovered." He didn't move. He didn't have to. The message was as clear as the stone walls outside. She was not a guest. She was a possession. Defeated, she turned and walked back to her room, the beautiful prison that was starting to feel more like a tomb. Giovanni was not a fool. He saw the new, defiant spark in her eyes, the restless energy that had replaced her weak compliance. He recognized the shift from a grateful patient to a caged animal, and he knew that her spirit, the very thing that had drawn him to her, would not tolerate being locked away without a fight. He needed to manage her, to soothe her agitation while reinforcing the reality of her situation. So he made a calculated gesture of goodwill, one that was, in reality, another masterclass in control. He had a laptop brought to her room one afternoon. It was sleek and new, but she knew instinctively it would be a closed system, a window to a world he curated. "I thought you might wish to speak with your brother," he said, his voice gentle, as if offering a great treat. Her heart leaped with a desperate hope, a feeling she immediately distrusted. The call was arranged. As the screen flickered to life, Giovanni settled into an armchair just out of the camera's line of sight. He said nothing, did nothing, but his presence filled the room, a silent, powerful pressure that she could feel in the air she breathed. Rico's face appeared, pixelated and a world away. He was in a stylish, modern apartment, the kind of place she knew he could never afford. He was wearing an expensive-looking sweater and a watch that glinted under the lights. He looked better, healthier, but his cheerfulness was a brittle, fragile thing. "Danny, you look great," he exclaimed, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "See, I told you Mr. Vitale would take care of you. He's a man of his word." "Rico," she said, her voice tight. "Where are you? Are you really okay? Tell me the truth." His eyes darted nervously to the side, just for a fraction of a second, a movement she knew was directed at the unseen presence in her room. "Of course, Danny. I've never been better," he said, his voice a little too loud. "This apartment, it's amazing. Mr. Vitale set it all up. And my new job, it's a big responsibility. I'm learning so much." He was talking quickly, reciting a script he had clearly memorized. He spoke of his new life, the fancy clothes, the respect he was being shown. But it all sounded hollow, like a story he was telling himself as much as her. She tried to cut through the performance, to find her brother beneath the polished facade. "Rico, I need to know what's really going on. I'm trapped here." Panic flashed in his eyes. No, you're safe there, Danny. That's the most important thing. You just focus on getting better. Everything is under control. Mr. Vitale knows what's best. He glanced off screen again, more obviously this time. Listen, I have to go. I have a meeting, a really important one. Rico, wait, but he was already ending the call. I love you, Danny. I'll talk to you soon. The screen went black, plunging the room into a sudden deafening silence. Daniela stared at her own reflection in the dark screen, a pale, haunted face looking back at her. The call hadn't been a connection, it had been a demonstration. Giovanni had shown her that he didn't just control her. He controlled her brother, her only link to the world she had lost. The carefully constructed performance left her feeling more isolated and terrified than ever before. It was a chilling, undeniable message, delivered without Giovanni having to say a single word. Her world was no longer her own, it was a stage, and he was the director of every scene. That night, she didn't wait for him to begin his nightly vigil. When he entered the room, she was waiting, not in bed, but standing by the window, her arms crossed, her fear forged into a cold, hard resolve. The time for passive acceptance was over. He stopped, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Daniela, I want to go home, she said, her voice devoid of the weakness he was used to. I'm grateful that you saved me, grateful for the doctors, for everything. But this has to stop. You can't keep me here. He walked toward her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His charming, gentle demeanor was gone, stripped away to reveal the man beneath, the man whose reputation was whispered in fear across the city. Can't I? He asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I'm not your prisoner, Giovanni. She shot back, her anger giving her strength. I have a life, a job, a home. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His eyes, dark and intense, bored into hers. You had a life, he said, and the cold authority in his voice made her blood run cold. That life ended the moment you stood in front of that gun. The men who came for me were from the Falcone family, my most bitter rivals. They are not reasonable, they are not merciful. By saving my life, by taking a bullet meant for me, you are no longer Daniela Cruz, paralegal. In their eyes, you are my woman, my property, and that makes you a target, a pawn they would use to hurt me. The brutal, ugly truth of his words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Your old apartment isn't safe, he continued, his voice relentless. Your job, your friends, every part of that life you want back is now a vulnerability, a place where they could find you. Leaving my protection isn't just unwise, Daniela, it's a death sentence. He stepped closer still, his intensity overwhelming, crowding out the air around her. He raised a hand and gently, almost reverently, touched the bandage on her shoulder through her silk robe. Your life is with me now, because only I can keep you breathing. Do you understand? His gaze held hers, a terrifying blend of raw power, chilling sincerity, and a dark, burning obsession. The last vestiges of her hope for a return to normalcy crumbled into dust, scattered by the force of his will. The room felt like it was shrinking, the beautiful walls closing in on her. This is not a cage, Daniela, he whispered, his voice dropping to a raw, possessive murmur that wrapped around her heart like a chain. It is a fortress, and I am the walls. Weeks bled into one another. A slow, monotonous drip of time measured in meals delivered on porcelain and the changing of floral arrangements. Daniela settled into a new kind of existence, a routine of quiet defiance. On the surface, she was the model patient, polite to Elena, compliant with the nurse, even offering Giovanni a cool, distant courtesy during his nightly vigils. But beneath the placid exterior, her mind was a whirlwind of activity, always working, always observing, cataloging the guards' routines, mapping the estate in her memory, searching for a flaw in the fortress walls. Her fear had not vanished. It had simply crystallized into a sharp, cold purpose. Escape. One crisp afternoon, the air holding the first real bite of late autumn, she was on her private balcony, wrapped in a cashmere throw. She had taken to spending hours out here, the illusion of openness, a small balm to her caged soul. It was from this vantage point that she saw him. Giovanni was walking in the garden below with another man, his second, In command, a lean, watchful man she had come to know as Luca. They moved toward a large, tiered stone fountain near the center of the garden, its splashing water creating a zone of relative privacy. They believed they were alone, their voices carrying upwards on the breeze, fragmented and distorted by the sound of the water. Daniela froze, melting back into the shadows of the balcony's alcove, every sense straining to listen. "A mess," Luca was saying, his voice a low growl. "The Falconies are animals, but they aren't sloppy." The timing was too perfect. Someone told them you would be there. Giovanni's reply was lost in a sudden gust of wind, but the rigid set of his shoulders spoke volumes. He was listening intently, his posture radiating a lethal stillness. "It was one of our own, Luca." Giovanni's voice cut through a moment later, clear and cold as ice. The words sent a shockwave through Daniela. Someone at that table. Someone who knew the reservation was changed at the last minute. The betrayal, she realized, was what truly infuriated him. It was a deeper wound than any rival's attack. "Find him," Giovanni commanded, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying an unmistakable promise of violence, "and find out what he knows about the girl." Daniela's breath caught in her throat. The girl, that was her. "They won't get a second chance at her," Giovanni continued, his voice now laced with a chilling possessiveness that she recognized from his nightly whispers. Luca's response was pragmatic. "We're looking, but boss, keeping her here, it makes her a bigger target. It shows everyone she's important to you." "Keeping her here," Giovanni stated, his voice absolute, a law of nature, "is the only thing that keeps her alive." Daniela shrank back from the railing, her blood running cold. The danger wasn't just outside the walls, it was inside. The fortress had a traitor within its ranks. The guards, the staff, even Luca. Every face was now a potential mask for the enemy. The gentle splashing of the fountain below, a sound she had found soothing just moments before, now seemed to mock her, its cheerful burble hiding the dark, deadly secrets of Giovanni's world. She felt a new kind of fear, a complex, insidious terror that was far worse than simply being a captive. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a prize to be fought over by monsters, and the most dangerous one of all might be sleeping under the same roof. That night, the air in the suite was thick with an unspoken tension. A storm was brewing outside, the wind rattling the glass of the French doors, mirroring the tempest inside Daniela. She didn't retreat to her bed. She stood in the center of the room, a solitary figure in borrowed silk, waiting for him. When Giovanni entered, he stopped short, immediately sensing the shift. The compliant patient was gone, replaced by a woman whose eyes burned with a cold, accusatory fire. "You lied to me," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a blade. He closed the door softly behind him, his expression hardening. "I have never lied to you. You let me believe the danger was just the Falconies, that it was all outside these walls," she countered, taking a step toward him. "But it's not, is it? There's a traitor, someone in your circle, someone who was at that restaurant, someone who sold you out and led them right to us." Giovanni's face became a mask of stone. His fury was palpable, not at her, but at the fact that she knew. "How?" he asked, the single word a low growl. "I heard you." "In the garden with Luca," she admitted, refusing to be intimidated. "Stop treating me like a child, Giovanni. Stop treating me like some fragile piece of glass. I took a bullet for you. I think I've earned the right to know who is trying to kill us." He was furious that she had spied on him. She could see it in the tight clench of his jaw, but beneath it, she saw something else, a flicker of grudging admiration. He was finally seeing her, not as the woman he had saved, but as a woman with a spine of steel, a woman who would not be placated with soft whispers and silk sheets. The dynamic between them shifted, the air crackling with a new, dangerous energy. It was no longer captor and captive. It was two people, bound together by a violent, treacherous reality. He walked toward her, his powerful frame seeming to consume the space between them. "You want the truth?" he said, his voice low and intense. "Fine. Yes. There is a traitor, someone I trusted, someone who ate at my table, betrayed me to my enemies, and in doing so, they put you in the line of fire. I am hunting him, and when I find him, I will do to him what our world demands." The raw brutality of his promise hung in the air. He was shielding her from the ugliest parts of his life, she realized, not just to protect her innocence, but to maintain his own curated image in her eyes. The argument, the storm outside, his raw anger, it all culminated in a moment of shattering honesty. "But you are wrong about one thing," he continued, stopping just before her. He reached out, not to touch her, but to hover his hand in the space between them, as if she were a flame he was drawn to but feared to touch. "My keeping you here, it is not just about the debt. It is not just about honor." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the authority, past the obsession, and saw the raw, unvarnished man. A man driven by forces she couldn't comprehend. "The truth?" he whispered, and the sound was more intimate than any touch. "The truth is that the moment you fell into my arms, bleeding because of me, you became mine. The debt I owe you can never be repaid with money or freedom. It can only be repaid with my protection for the rest of your life." He finally closed the distance, his fingers gently brushing her cheek, his touch sending a shock of heat through her. "I look at you, and I don't see a debt. I see my future, and I will burn the world down to protect it." His confession was not romantic. It was raw, possessive, and utterly terrifying. It was a claim, a branding of her soul. Yet, it was also the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. In his dark, violent world, this was his version of a vow. For the first time, Daniela saw the man behind the monster, a man whose intensity was as frightening as it was undeniably real. The fortress walls he spoke of were not just stone and wire, they were the unyielding cage of his obsession. The confrontation was a turning point, a fault line that shifted the very ground beneath Daniela's feet. In the days that followed, the dynamic between them changed. Giovanni's nightly vigils became less about watching over a sleeping patient and more like meetings. He still treated her with a fierce possessiveness, but it was now tempered with a new, grudging respect. He had seen her intelligence, her nerve, and he began to test it. He started bringing her files. They were not the sensitive documents that detailed the dark underbelly of his empire, but contracts and business proposals related to his legitimate enterprises, a portfolio of real estate holdings, import, export companies, and investment firms that provided a plausible front for his real work. "My lawyers are competent," he said one evening, dropping a thick folder onto the table in her sitting room. "But they are predictable. I want a different perspective. Your perspective." At first, she was hesitant, seeing it as another form of control, another way to bind her to his world. But the sight of the legal documents, the familiar weight of the paper, the dense blocks of text, it called to a part of her she thought was gone forever. Starved for mental stimulation, for a sense of purpose beyond merely surviving each day, she gave in. She sat down, picked up a pen, and began to read. It was like coming home. The language of clauses, of liabilities and indemnifications, was a language she spoke fluently. The world of Giovanni Vitale, with its unspoken threats and violent codes, faded into the background. Here, in the black and white of the contracts, she was in her element. She was Daniela Cruz, the sharp, meticulous paralegal. She worked for hours, her focus absolute, the scratch of her pen on the paper, the only sound in the room. She found loopholes his legal team had missed, pointed out ambiguous language that could be exploited, and suggested revisions that strengthened his position. She was not just reading, she was dissecting, analyzing, and improving. Giovanni would sit across from her, watching in silence, a tumbler of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. He saw the transformation, the way her posture straightened, the way her eyes lit up with focused intensity. He was seeing the woman she was before him, the woman whose strength was not just in her spirit, but in her mind. One night, after she had spent 2 hours methodically tearing apart a flawed acquisition agreement, she pushed the annotated papers across the table toward him. "Your exposure on the environmental liability clause in Section 5 is unacceptable," she said, her tone crisp and professional, "and the arbitration terms are a disaster waiting to happen." He picked up the documents, his eyes scanning her neat, precise notes in the margins. A slow, small smile touched his lips, a genuine expression so rare it was startling. "You have a sharp mind, Daniela," he said, his voice holding a note of sincere admiration. sharper than half the men I pay a fortune to. She didn't look up, instead focusing on organizing the remaining papers into a neat stack. The compliment sent a strange, unwelcome warmth through her, a feeling she refused to acknowledge. "It's what I do," she replied, her voice cool. Or, "what I used to do." The words hung in the air, a reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. But as she felt the solid weight of the files in her hands, the familiar act of highlighting a clause felt like a lifeline. It was a small island of normalcy in a vast sea of madness, a fragile, unspoken partnership beginning to form in the quiet of the gilded cage. She was no longer just a passive object to be protected. She was contributing, using her skills, proving her worth beyond the single, desperate act that had brought her here. It was a subtle shift, but a significant one, a glimmer of agency that complicated everything. Her desire for freedom was still a burning fire within her, but now it was tangled with the complex, unsettling satisfaction of being seen, of being valued, by the very man who held her captive. The fragile partnership they had built, a delicate structure of contracts and unspoken respect, was shattered by the brutal intrusion of the outside world. The change came not with a bang, but with the quiet, urgent arrival of Luca. He entered the sitting room where Daniela was reviewing a lease agreement and Giovanni was watching her, a rare look of peace on his face. Luca didn't wait for an invitation to speak. His expression was grim, his usual deference replaced by stark urgency. "Boss, we have a problem," he said, his voice a low, tense growl. "We intercepted a communication. The Falcones. They're getting desperate. They know we're hunting the leak, and they can't get to you here." He paused, his gaze flickering almost imperceptibly toward Daniela. "So they're changing tactics. They're going to grab the brother." The air in the room turned to ice. The lease agreement slipped from Daniela's fingers, scattering across the polished wood floor. Rico. The name was a silent scream in her mind. The theoretical danger, the shadowy threats she had been living with, suddenly had a face, her brother's face. Giovanni didn't move. He didn't shout or curse. Instead, a terrifying stillness settled over him. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, flat emptiness that was more frightening than any overt display of anger. It was the calm of a predator that has just been challenged, a quiet, controlled rage that promised absolute annihilation. He rose slowly from his chair, his movements fluid and deliberate. "They think she is your Achilles' heel, boss," Luca continued, his voice tight. "They think you'll do anything to get her back, and that grabbing her brother is the easiest way to draw her out." Giovanni turned his gaze on Daniela. The look in his eyes was devoid of any softness, any of the possessive warmth she had grown accustomed to. It was the look of a commander assessing a strategic reality. Her blood ran cold, a freezing wave of panic that left her breathless. This was no longer a game of gilded cages and intellectual exercises. This was about Rico, her reckless, foolish, beloved brother, being swallowed by the world she had fallen into. "They are going to use your brother to get to you," Giovanni said, his voice a low, grim statement of fact. He walked over to her, his presence a towering wall of dark intent. "I am going to handle this. You will stay here, and you will be safe. That is not a request." He reached out, his fingers gripping her upper arms, his touch not gentle, but grounding, forcing her to meet his gaze. "But I need you to understand," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "What happens next will not be pretty. There will be no negotiations. There will be no warnings. I am going to remove this threat permanently. Do you understand me, Daniela?" She could only nod, her throat tight with terror. She saw in his eyes the promise of a violence she could barely comprehend, a brutal response to a line that had been crossed. The threat against her was one thing, an attack on his honor, his possession. But using her family, using Rico, that was a different kind of sin in his world, one that demanded a swift and merciless damnation. Her protector was gone, and in his place stood the Mafia boss, a man preparing to unleash hell, all in her name. The fortress became a prison again, but this time the bars were forged from her own frantic worry. Giovanni had her locked in the suite, with 2 guards posted outside her door instead of the usual one at the end of the hall. The luxury that surrounded her was a mockery. The silk sheets felt like a shroud, the opulent furniture like relics in a tomb. She paced the length of the rooms, a caged animal driven mad by helplessness. Her mind was a canvas for horrors, painting vivid, terrible images of what could be happening to Rico. She imagined him being dragged into a car, his charming smile frozen in terror, his desperate calls for help swallowed by the city's uncaring noise. Every passing minute was an eternity of silent screaming. The beautiful, manicured gardens outside her window seemed to taunt her with their peace, a stark contrast to the storm of fear raging within her. The narrative of the day was written in sounds she could only guess at. She heard the low rumble of multiple cars starting in the courtyard below, the quiet, clipped commands of men moving with purpose. There was no shouting, no chaos, just the chilling hum of a well-oiled machine of violence being set in motion. She pressed her ear to the door, but could hear nothing but the steady breathing of the guards outside. She was completely cut off, a spectator to a war being fought over her, with her brother as the battlefield. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky, its light shifting from the bright gold of afternoon to the bloody orange of sunset. And still, there was nothing but silence. The silence was worse than any noise. It was a vacuum, filled only by the frantic beating of her own heart. She didn't eat. She didn't sit. She just paced, her path a well-worn track in the expensive rug, her mind circling the same terrifying question over and over. Is he alive? It was well after midnight when she heard the cars return. The sound was different this time, quieter, more final. She stood by the window, peering through a gap in the heavy curtains, and saw Giovanni step out of his black sedan. He moved with the same unhurried grace as always, his suit as immaculate as if he were returning from a business dinner. He said a few quiet words to Luca, then walked toward the entrance of the house, disappearing from her view. She waited, her entire body trembling. The lock on her door clicked open. Giovanni entered, closing it softly behind him. He looked exactly as he had when he left, his powerful frame filling the doorway. But as he stepped into the light of the lamp, she saw it. On the pristine white cuff of his shirt, just above the diamond cufflink, was a single, small, dark stain. It was no bigger than a teardrop, but it screamed of the night's brutal work. His face was like stone, his eyes holding the cold, empty finality of a finished war. He didn't need to say a word. She knew. He had unleashed the full, terrifying power of his position. He had done the devil's work to keep her safe. Her voice was a fragile, trembling thing, a whisper in the heavy silence of the room. "Is it over?" she asked, her eyes fixed on that dark stain. "Is Rico safe?" Giovanni's gaze met hers. There was no apology in his eyes, no regret, only a flat statement of fact. "He is," he said, his voice calm and steady. "They will not touch your family again. I have made that clear." She looked at him, at this man who moved through the world like a god of his own dark creation, dispensing life and death according to his own unbreakable code. She saw the killer, the monster she had heard whispered about, and she was terrified. A part of her was repulsed to her very soul. But beneath the terror, a deeper, more shameful emotion rose within her, a profound and overwhelming wave of relief. It was a feeling so potent it made her sick with guilt, but she couldn't deny it. He had done what he promised. He had kept her brother safe. The monster had protected her. The incident was a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of their old dynamic. The distance between them, the pretense of captor and grateful captive, was gone, incinerated in the heat of the night's violence. When Daniela looked at Giovanni now, she no longer saw just the man who held her prisoner. She saw the man who had waded into the darkness for her, the monster who had shielded her family with his own brutality. And when he looked at her, he no longer saw a fragile doll to be protected, but a woman who had looked upon his true nature and had not shattered. A new, more complex intimacy developed between them, forged in shared secrets and the chilling reality of what he had done for her. She began to see his world not as a simple dichotomy of black and white, but in terrifying shades of gray. His methods were savage, but they were governed by a fierce, unwavering code of honor and protection, a code that now included her and her family at its very center. The fear remained, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was now interwoven with a twisted sense of security, a feeling of being cherished by the most dangerous man she had ever known. her mind, desperate for a problem to solve that didn't involve her own heart, fixated on the one loose thread, the original sin of their situation, the traitor. She could not control her confinement, she could not control Giovanni's world, but she could use the one thing that was still truly hers, her analytical mind. One evening, as they sat in the heavy silence of the sitting room, she finally spoke the thoughts that had been circling in her head for days. "The restaurant," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I keep going back to it." Giovanni looked up from the report he was reading, his attention immediately hers. "What about it? You said the traitor had to be someone who knew you'd be there," she began, piecing the puzzle together as a lawyer would, laying out the facts. "Someone who knew the location, but that's not quite right, is it? The Falconese man was disguised as a waiter. That takes time to set up. They must have known you were coming well in advance." She paused, looking at him, her gaze steady. "But you told me something else, a few weeks ago. You said you changed the reservation time at the last minute, that you pushed it back by an hour. You were annoyed that you had to." Giovanni's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned forward, placing his report on the table, his focus now entirely on her. He remembered the detail, but he hadn't seen its significance. He had been focused on who knew the location, not the timing. "So, the traitor," Daniela continued, her voice gaining strength as the logic solidified, "wasn't just someone who knew you were going to Il Silenzio. It had to be someone who knew about the time change. Someone who could give the Falcones the exact window you would be there, despite your last-minute adjustment." She held his gaze, her heart beginning to pound with a dreadful premonition. "Who knew about the change, Giovanni? Not just the location, the exact updated time." A slow, dangerous realization dawned in Giovanni's eyes. The net of suspects, which had included a dozen men, suddenly shrank with breathtaking speed. He had made the call to the restaurant himself. After that, he had only spoken to 3 people about the new time. His mind raced, ticking off the names like a death sentence. "Only 3 people knew," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that sent a chill down Daniela's spine. He looked at her, and she saw the cold calculus of his world playing out in his eyes. "Luca, my driver, Antonio." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick and suffocating, hanging in the air between them. Daniela's heart stopped, a cold, hard knot of dread tightening in her chest. She knew the 3rd name before he said it. She saw it in the hardening of his jaw, in the terrifying stillness that came over his face as he considered the unthinkable. Enrico. The name hung in the air between them, a poisoned dart. Rico. Daniela felt the world tilt on its axis, the floor dropping away from beneath her feet. It was impossible. A thought so monstrous her mind refused to form it. Her brother, her reckless, charming, foolish brother, the very reason she had stepped into this nightmare, could not be the author of it. She looked at Giovanni, searching his face for some mistake, some other possibility, but found only the cold, hard certainty of a man who dealt in brutal truths. The fortress he had built around her had not been to keep the enemy out, it had been to contain the fallout from a betrayal that had come from the one person she loved most in the world. Giovanni did not need to see the devastation on her face to know the depth of her wound. He investigated her lead with the cold, swift efficiency of a surgeon excising a cancer. The evidence he gathered was absolute, undeniable, and damning. Rico's gambling debts were not just bad, they were catastrophic, a black hole of IOUs to loan sharks far more vicious than the Falcones. Drowning in a sea of threats against his own life, he had made a desperate, foolish bargain. He had given the Falcones the location and the original time of the dinner, believing they would simply rough Giovanni up, a show of force that would spook his sister's keeper, and, in the chaos, get his own debts cleared by both sides as a reward. He never imagined they would try to kill him. He never, in his wildest, most selfish nightmares, imagined Daniela would be the one to get hurt. Giovanni confronted Rico not in a dungeon with tools of pain, but in the sleek, modern apartment he had provided for him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the proof on the polished glass coffee table, phone records, bank statements, a timeline of events that formed an inescapable cage of guilt. Rico broke. He didn't just confess. He disintegrated, collapsing into a sobbing, incoherent wreck consumed by a shame so profound it was a physical agony. The weight of what he had done, the image of his sister taking a bullet meant for a man he had sold out, had shattered him completely. Giovanni brought the confession to Daniela. He didn't soften the blow. He laid out the facts with the same dispassionate clarity he would use in a business meeting, presenting her with the full, ugly scope of her brother's betrayal. He stood before her, the arbiter of a dark and violent world, and explained the law that governed it. "He betrayed me," Giovanni said, his voice a low, steady rumble that held no malice, only the weight of an unbreakable code. "He put you in the path of a bullet. My laws are clear on this. The penalty for treason is death." He let the words hang in the silent room, heavy and final. Then, he took a step closer, his eyes searching hers, looking for the woman of steel he had come to respect. "But you are not bound by my laws. He is your brother." He paused, and in that moment, he ceded a portion of his absolute power to her, a gesture more intimate than any caress. "What happens to him," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is your choice." It was a test, she knew, but it was more than that. It was a coronation. He was handing her a scepter, asking her to rule on the fate of the only piece of her old life that remained. The betrayal was a wound deeper than the bullet had ever been, a searing pain that hollowed out her soul. Her love for Rico, the fierce, protective instinct that had defined her entire life, was at war with the brutal, undeniable logic of the world she now inhabited. Any mercy she showed would be a vulnerability, a chink in the armor of the man who had become her entire world. Any justice she demanded would mean signing her own brother's death warrant. She looked at Giovanni, at his unyielding face, and saw the terrible, magnificent burden of his power, a burden he was now asking her to share. Her heart, her very soul, was being torn in two. Daniela's choice, when it came, was delivered in a voice she barely recognized as her own. It was cold, quiet, and utterly devoid of emotion. "He will live," she said, meeting Giovanni's gaze without flinching, "but he will be dead to me." She laid out her terms, her voice gaining a chilling, regal authority. Rico would be sent away, exiled to a place where his name meant nothing, where the Vitale influence could not touch him but where its shadow would prevent him from ever returning. He would be given nothing, no money, no contacts, no second chances. He would be erased, a ghost banished from her life and from the organization he had betrayed. It was a living death, a sentence of perpetual loneliness, and by the brutal standards of Giovanni's world, it was an act of profound mercy. Giovanni listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he simply nodded once, a gesture of acceptance and respect. Her judgment was law. He had tested her, and she had not chosen sentiment or vengeance. She had chosen a third path, one of cold, pragmatic justice that protected his authority while satisfying her own broken heart. In that moment, she was no longer his captive. She was his queen. With the traitor dealt with, a cold peace settled over the estate, but it was the quiet of a coiled snake. The final problem remained: Marco Falcone. Giovanni, with Daniela's verdict still echoing in the air, moved to end the war. He sent a message to his rival, agreeing to a truce meeting to settle the conflict between their families. It was a lie, a perfectly crafted piece of bait for a trap he intended to spring. He knew Falcone would see it as an opportunity to finish the job he had started in the restaurant. That evening, as Giovanni prepared to leave, Daniela stood before him, dressed not in the soft silks he provided, but in a sharp, dark pantsuit she had requested from Elena. "I'm coming with you," she said. It was not a question. Giovanni turned, his hand freezing on the knot of his tie. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." "The danger has been living in this house with me for months," she countered, her voice steady. "I started this, Giovanni, the moment I stood in front of you. Let me help you finish it." She stepped closer, her eyes burning with a cold, focused fire he had never seen before. "They still see me as your weakness, as the little paralegal you're obsessed with. They won't be expecting me to be anything else. Let's use that. I can be your eyes, your ears. I'll see things your men might miss, notice things a rival gangster wouldn't." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the victim he had saved, but a warrior forged in the fires of his world. He saw the steel in her spine, the sharp intelligence in her eyes, and he knew she was right. Her presence was the one variable Falcone could not account for. After a long, searching moment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Stay by my side," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Do exactly as I say, and we will walk out of there together." He pressed a small, discreet communication device into her palm, its cold metal a final, binding contract. This was her initiation, her final vow. As they walked out of the mansion side by side, they were not a captor and his prize. They were a unit, a dark king and his unexpected formidable queen, moving as one toward the final checkmate. The warehouse smelled of rust, damp concrete, and betrayal. It was a vast, cavernous space on the industrial outskirts of the city, chosen for its supposed neutrality. The tension was a physical entity, so thick it was hard to breathe. In the center of the space, under the stark glare of a single dangling industrial lamp, stood Marco Falcone, flanked by his men. He was a man who wore his arrogance like a tailored suit, his lips curled in a smug, confident smirk. He believed he had Giovanni cornered, lured into the open by a woman. "Giovanni," Falcone greeted him, his voice oozing false cordiality. His eyes slid to Daniela, dismissing her with a contemptuous glance. "And you brought her. You really are a fool in love." Giovanni ignored the taunt, his face a mask of calm indifference. As the two bosses began to talk, exchanging veiled threats disguised as negotiations, Daniela's senses went on high alert. She stood slightly behind Giovanni, her posture demure, her eyes downcast, playing the part of the frightened girlfriend perfectly. But beneath the facade, she was scanning every shadow, every catwalk, every glint of metal. She saw it almost immediately, a flicker of movement on a high catwalk to their left, a man out of place, then another, a subtle reflection of a rifle barrel in the grimy glass of a high window. The trap was real, and it was closing. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hand, hidden in the pocket of her jacket, was steady as she pressed the small button on the communication device twice. The prearranged signal for ambush confirmed. Giovanni didn't even flinch. His conversation with Falcone continued for another 30 seconds, a lifetime in the charged silence. Then, just as Falcone's smirk widened, a signal that the trap was about to be sprung, Giovanni made a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture with his left hand. The world exploded. It was not the chaos of the restaurant, but a symphony of controlled, ruthless violence. Doors that had seemed to be part of the warehouse walls slid open, and Giovanni's men, already in position, poured in, their movements precise and deadly. The ambush was countered before it had even truly begun. The conflict was swift, brutal, and utterly decisive. In the ensuing chaos, Giovanni moved with a predator's grace, his path cutting directly toward a stunned Marco Falcone. The fight was over in moments. When the echoing gunshots faded, a profound silence descended upon the warehouse, thick with the smell of gunpowder. Giovanni stood victorious, the threat to his life, and to Daniela's, eliminated permanently. He turned to the man who had called her his weakness, his face cold as stone. "She was never my weakness," Giovanni said, his voice resonating in the sudden quiet. "She was my reason." He then turned his back on his fallen rival and walked toward Daniela, his eyes, intense and unwavering, finding hers through the haze. She had not flinched. She had not screamed. She had watched the brutal price of her safety being paid, and she had understood. This was the cost of the promise he had made to her. Back in the mansion, the adrenaline of the night faded, leaving a deep, resonant quiet in its wake. The war was over. They stood alone in the grand living room, the fire crackling in the hearth, the shadows dancing on the walls. Giovanni walked toward her, his eyes searching her face, looking for any sign of fear, of regret, of the woman she had been. He found none. In her eyes, he saw only a quiet, resolute acceptance, a strength that mirrored his own. He stopped before her and took her hand, his touch no longer that of a captor, but of a partner, an equal. He lifted her hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers. The vow he had whispered to her in the dark when she was a broken, unconscious thing in his bed, now had a new, unbreakable meaning for them both. "I told you," he said, his voice a low, possessive murmur that was now a promise, not a threat, that I would never let you go. Daniela looked into the eyes of the monster who had become her shield, her captor who had become her champion. The gilded cage had not broken her, it had reforged her. She had made her choice, not in a moment of passion, but in the cold, clear light of understanding. She had chosen this life, this man, and the perilous, absolute safety he offered. She met his intense gaze, her voice clear and strong, the sound of a queen claiming her throne. "I know," she said, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips for the first time, "and I'm not going anywhere.